So you want to get into PC gaming, but you're on a really tight budget. I know, I've been there before. So why don't you upgrade an office PC into a pretty good 1080p gaming rig? It requires minimal effort for pretty substantial gaming performance gains, and a lot of office PCs already come with relatively decent specs apart from the graphics card. Most office PCs will come with an i5 or maybe even an i7, at least 8GB of RAM in most cases. Some may even come with 16GB. And most of them come with really reliable power supplies, albeit sometimes the wattage is pretty low. Before I get into the video, if you enjoy the content, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell, as it does help me out quite a bit. If you're unfamiliar with this PC, this is the £65 gaming PC which I bought a few months ago, and I made a video on it a couple of weeks ago too, which you can find up there. But it performed very, let's say, terrible in games which released in 2009. It just about ran Minecraft at 720p, so this is the kind of PC that we were looking at. But that's okay, it had a relatively solid foundation where I could apply some upgrades to it and I could extract some pretty good value gaming performance. And if you're looking to upgrade your office PC that you have at home, you can watch this video as sort of a guideline of what to upgrade and why you should upgrade it. And I'll be going through these steps in the video. The first and probably the most important upgrade for system responsiveness is the SSD. It's 2023 now, you should not be using a hard drive as a boot drive, no matter what budget you're at. That's because SSDs like this 256GB SSD from Silicon Power only cost around £18 for a massive improvement in both system loading times and system responsiveness. And 256GB is plenty for core applications, Windows, and maybe even a few games like Minecraft, but don't expect to be putting Warzone on this SSD, for instance. To put it in, I took out this DVD drive, because who uses a DVD drive here in 2023? And the cables just go straight in, so it was very little hassle. The i3 in this PC was totally fine for the GT210, but if you want a much more powerful graphics card, it won't cut the chase. This is why I spent £8 on this i5 3470. It has 4 physical cores, 6MB of L3 cache, and a clock speed of 3.2 GHz. This should pair pretty well with our RX 570, which we'll be putting in shortly. I would probably recommend upgrading to even an i7 3770, as these have hyper-threading and 8MB of L3 cache, which would provide a substantial gaming performance boost, which would result in a way smoother gaming experience. More on that later. Now onto the graphics card. This is the biggest upgrade in any gaming PC you could make. Gone is the GT210, which is an absolutely awful GPU, but I won't get fixated on that. We are putting in an RX 570 4GB. This is a massive upgrade. This Polaris card is still supported by AMD, and it still runs most games which are launching today. And thanks to the 450W power supply in this PC, it has enough juice to run it too. Even though I did have to use this very questionable 2 Molex to PCIe 6-pin connector, which I do not recommend under any circumstances use one of these. I was fine personally during my testing, but I can't recommend you to do the same. And with all these upgrades done, it is time to install Windows on the SSD. You could either install from scratch, or if you want to clone the old operating system, that's totally fine too, as we're not moving from AMD to Intel, for instance, so you should be fine there too. Now let's see how it performs. In Cinebench, the i5 3470 got 679 for the single core performance, and in the multi-core test it got 2047. It's not the best, but the i7 would be way better here if I'm honest, because it has that hyper-threading which would help with that multi-core just a bit, and the single core would be slightly better too, thanks to the better cache, and thanks to the high base clock on it too. I started off the gaming benchmarks with the hardest game to run, and that is Cyberpunk 2077. And for obvious reasons here, I set it to the low preset with low crowds, enabled FSR quality and high textures as well, so the game did look pretty good if I'm honest. This netted 52 FPS on average with 28 FPS for the 1% low. It was a tiny bit stuttery if I'm honest, but it wasn't as bad as what I was expecting it to be. Cyberpunk does tend to run pretty poorly on a 4-core 4-thread CPU, so yeah, maybe this is something that i7 will be able to iron out. Next up is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Here I set it to the basic preset with normal textures and FSR quality. The normal textures is totally doable with 4 gigs of frame buffer, and the game looks relatively decent with normal textures as well. This got 84 FPS on average with 55 FPS for the 1% low. It ran pretty well here if I'm honest, but if you're more into Warzone, I suspect the performance is going to be slightly worse as it's a much bigger map and the CPU's got to do a lot more work with the draw distance. So gameplay in multiplayer will be totally fine. In Warzone your mileage may vary. Minecraft is up next. I tested this in the first video and it did not great on the GT210, but here it did relatively decent as I set it to 8 chunks render distance on the fancy settings with Optifine. This got 183 FPS on average with 124 for the 1% low. The CPU was pretty pegged in Minecraft, it was hovering around 90 to 100%, so this is not ideal, and yet again the i7 would be a very good option for Minecraft as it does saturate 4 cores these days. F1 22 was a game that actually surprised me today as the CPU didn't hold back the RX 570, so that's pretty good. Here I set it to the medium preset in my wet Australian GP benchmark and it got 90 FPS on average with 58 FPS for the 1% low. If you want to play F1 on a similar configuration, you'll be having a great gaming experience here. There was hardly any stutter, the game looks relatively decent, and the performance was just nice and smooth. Fortnite is probably the biggest disappointment today because with the DirectX 12 API, I set it to the medium with low draw distance because I kept that CPU in mind as well. It got 83 FPS on average with 8, and yes, that is 8 for the 1% low. This is pretty unplayable. Because of this, I set Fortnite to the performance as well, and things didn't really get that much better if I'm honest. The average did jump up to 158, but the 1% low was still shockingly low at only 14, so it's not good. Just get the i7 for Fortnite. Don't even bother playing this game on 4 cores, it's certainly not worth it. I tested Fallout New Vegas again, mainly because I just thought I would for some reason. Here I set it to the ultra preset and it got 65 FPS on average with 42 FPS for the 1% low. It's a Bethesda game, it's going to stutter, no matter if you've got a 13900K and an RTX 4090, it's going to stutter because the Bethesda engine is not very good at all, but it plays pretty well all things considered. As it should, to be fair, because it did release in 2010. Last game up is GTA 5, and here I set it to the high preset with 2 times MSAA. This got 61 FPS on average with 42 for the 1% low. So GTA ran relatively fine here, there were no major issues or anything like that, it ran totally fine. So judging by all these figures, and I know I said it while I was benchmarking, the i5 3470 is holding back the RX 570 in quite a few games. Some games like F1 22 was totally fine, there was no CPU bottleneck and the game felt nice and smooth. But in games like Fortnite and even Minecraft actually, the stutter was very apparent because them 1% lows weren't great. Especially in Fortnite with the DirectX 12 API, 8 frames for the 1% low it's not a smooth experience, let me tell you that. This is where the i7 3770 would have a massive performance advantage, and mainly down to that hyper-threading. 4 threads in 2023 is a very hard recommendation now, if I'm honest. You need at least 8 threads for gaming in 2023, I would like to say. Maybe even 12. But as we've seen, if you're playing a more GPU-bound game like F1 22, the i5 is totally fine in these games, so you've got to evaluate whether the upgrade to the i7 is worth it. Personally, I recommend it for an extra like £15, I think the i7 is, over the i5. I'd say just go for the i7. The TDP is relatively the same and it will still work with the Intel Stock Cooler 2 and the power supply. And this is a recommendation I'd make to all Intel generations before Coffee Lake, because before Coffee Lake, all the i5s were non-hyper-threaded 4 cores and all the i7s on the consumer socket were 4 cores and 8 threads. So if you're on one of these generations, I'd recommend getting the i7, which is the non-K variant, as it would work very well in an office PC like this. Another upgrade I'd make is to the RAM, and I would only do this after upgrading the CPU. 8GB of RAM was certainly not an issue in today's testing, but if you want to do a bit more multitasking and as your OS gets a bit older and you get more OS bloat, a lot more RAM will start to be used. This is where 16GB of RAM is a good option. DDR3 and even DDR4 are incredibly cheap, especially if you look in the right places. So I'd recommend picking up 16 gigs just to be on the safe side. So is upgrading an Office PC into a budget 1080p gaming rig still the meta in 2023? And I'd say probably not, thanks to consoles like the Xbox Series S. The Xbox Series S offers incredible value at only around £250 here in the UK, I believe it is. And if you want a sole gaming machine, the Xbox Series S is an incredible value. But that being said, the Series S is only good for gaming and content consumption. If you want to play games and do office work at the same time, or even school work, stuff like that, I'd recommend getting the PC. You could even start a business from a PC like this. So if you want a gaming and work machine, I don't think you'd go wrong with upgrading an Office PC like this. Just don't make the same mistakes that I did with going with the 4-core, 4-thread i5. Get an i7, you'll thank me later. So with this being said, I'm going to leave the video here. If you like this video, like it, stay subscribed for more tech content, and I'll catch you in the next one.